So we're going to go ahead and get started with this wonderful panel that I'm so excited to moderate on triage and rationing. So just a few sentences on this very briefly. As we know, justice is only possible in the context of scarcity. But I'm not sure that ethics, broadly speaking, in the ways in which we were talking about it here, is really the same. So some ethical questions, like the ones that we heard about in the previous panel, questions about privacy, for example, are not so much attached to matters of scarcity. But the ethical questions that we want to discuss in this panel or in this domain about triage and rationing are actually quite tightly related to matters of scarcity. And of course, in the context of the classroom and other educational contexts, we are always experiencing some forms of scarcity, whether it's the scarcity of funding and money more broadly, the scarcity of time and attention that the teacher can give to all of her students, and increasingly, of course, the scarcity of the teachers themselves, which are missing or in short supply across the system. And this has been the case for a long time, but it's even more pressingly so since COVID. And so I think it's important to pay attention to matters of triaging, whether and when they are justified and according to which standards, etc. And so this is the topic that we're going to focus on in the next hour and a little bit. And our presenters, in order of their appearance after me here on the podium, the first one will be Jen Jennings, who's Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, where she's also the director of the Education Research Section. And she works on the distribution of goods and services to children and to schools using various methodological approaches. And so I'm excited to hear from Jen first. The next presenter will be Govind Prasad, who is Assistant Professor at the Strum College of Law at the University of Denver, where he works on bioethics and public law and on the allocation of scarce resources. And the previous time that I saw Govind present was when I was a fellow at the Safra Center a couple of years back. And Govind won't remember that, both because we were all on Zoom and because he was holding an entirely brand new baby while he was giving his talk. So you know that he's fabulous. And so I look forward to hearing your talk this time, standing solo by the podium. And our last speaker will be Kalia Hopkins, who is a specialized student support lead at the New York City Department of Education, where she's a special education instructional coach, or she has been a special education instructional coach for 9 years, and prior to that, like me, was a special education teacher, and she develops curricular materials on race and cultural responsive pedagogy. And so I'm excited to hear from Kalia about how some of these issues that we are facing are both applied and contemplated on in the context of practice. And so without further ado, Jen, the podium is yours.
Yeah. Am I on?
Yes.
All right. So good morning, everyone, or good late morning. I'm delighted to be here to talk with you about a set of issues that have occupied my attention for quite some time, which have to do with the ways in which we ration resources both within and between schools and education. Great. So I want to first assert that more resources will never solve this problem in its entirety. More resources certainly help, right? But to the extent that in education we can always further develop kids, there's always a little bit more that we can do. it's always going to be the case that we have to contend in both at the policy level and at the practice level with issues of rationing. Slide. So, what are the consequences of obscuring this? People are very uncomfortable with talking about this openly, despite the fact that every classroom teacher understands that they are but one person among 34 in some cases. So I'm going to argue that the problem with not making it explicit is that we have a street level kind of rationing that happens that's entirely decentralized, that lacks decision rules that we have often in the way that we allocate organs or other services in an emergency room, for example. So there's a lack of transparency. And I also think it, in many ways, doesn't acknowledge for educators the extent to which they are not fully responsible for this problem. So the idea of moral injury, I think, becomes very relevant here in terms of how folks experience their ability to meet all of these needs at once, and make these decisions very quickly as they're going through them. Slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you first a stylized example of educational triage with an assist from The Simpsons. And let me tell you how I came to study this. So it was like 2003. And the trial behind this is being implemented. I went to do field work in Texas, which, as many of you know, had an accountability system since 1994. I was interested in understanding, based on research that David Gilborn and W. Udell had done in the UK, whether or not similar rationing processes were happening in the United States. And so one of the first faculty meetings I went into with the third grade team, there were like these massive sheets, again, this is 20 years ago, across all of the table, and everyone has red, yellow, and green pens, and people are like coloring each objective, and who's in the red, the below the bubble, the yellow, the bubble, and the green, the folks who were definitely going to pass. So what this line here is representing is the proficiency cut score. And what I want to draw your attention to here is that where we set that line affects who may be the focus of attention. So if we set that cut score further up the distribution and in fact still focus on proficiency, which we've never really walked away from despite also measuring growth at this point, folks at that cusp, what I found in the school, and I'll do slide, essentially all kind of additional time, resources, attention were focused on kids who were right below passing. So in practice, these are some quotes from teachers describing what they call the bubble kids. In practice, what that meant is that music, art teachers were focusing additional time and attention on those kids outside of class. Additional tutoring was being allocated to those students, both within and outside of class, group instruction, etc. So certainly, as these quotes kind of illustrate, there was a sense that these were the kids, as a third quote says, that could make it. These are the ones that, as the last one says, we would move to the top of our pile. But this leaves what we'll often refer to as kids who are too low, or the hopeless cases, behind, so slide. So a couple of different quotes, interestingly, one from a second grade teacher that's actually not a tested grade in Texas at the time. So the first fifth grade teacher saying, if they're below 50, they're so low, it's really a lost cause. And again, the lost cause here is vis-a-vis the state test. But this way of talking and thinking about kids was very pervasive. And these are all folks who loved their kids, loved teaching. This is not a story about bad apples, this is a story about the system that we've built. Similarly, you have an example from a second grade teacher. If we go from a 22 to a 40, which is a huge gain, right? That's a remarkable gain. They still won't be close to passing, so they were kind of thinking of the cut score as around 70 at this time. And she goes on to tell me, we're sitting in this particular case on the park bench, I very much remember it, Like which says the child, left behind, but some kids will always be left behind. Some of them are just too low. It's like, so does this matter, right? Like in terms of this, it matters from a moral and ethical standpoint, I think, a priori, but as a social scientist, I'm also going to demonstrate for you that it actually matters in terms of where growth is going to happen. So in this example, the state of Texas, during this period, had set the past cut score higher up the distribution for math than for reading, which meant that you would then expect attention to be focused on the reading test, on the bottom kids, and on the math test in the middle of the distribution. Slide. So what I'm going to show you here is the parts of the distribution, right, that are the marginal parts. So you've got Milhouse on the one hand and Bart on the other. Again, really drawing attention to the fact that where we set that line affects who is focused on. And if you could slide. So what we end up finding in this paper is that there is additional growth in terms of reading and math scores at the parts of the distribution that are the marginal parts. So it's not simply a series of inputs, which I would still say are relevant, that are affected here, but also kids' outcomes. Slide. Okay, and what's interesting is, like, one thing that really, as a recent teacher, stood out to me was these questions of professional ethics have been very much supplanted by the idea of this third party, the data, making me do it, essentially. And so constantly it was like, we do this because of the data, we're data-driven, we're evidence-driven. But in many respects, I think this displaced and obscured, and in some respects legitimated this way of allocating resources without a lot of conversation about who was being not attended to in a school that had a sizable fraction of kids who were below the bubble. Slide. Okay, so to finish up here, I want to just think a little bit with you about the both normative and empirical dimensions that I think we want to know more about in order to develop an ethics or kind of framework for thinking about the way that these decisions are made. So I first want to draw attention to the macro level, so that it's not just happening as a bedside or classroom piece, but state, federal, and in fact local policymakers all play a central role in determining the degree of triage that's going to happen. Again, I think we have an endemic problem in this particular field because of the asymptote to infinity with educational goods that can happen, but certainly those folks play a big role. The second is that policymakers assign rights to categories of kids, and they often assign different enforcement mechanisms to those rights. So my former graduate student, now colleague, Rebecca Johnson's beautiful, beautiful dissertation that is comparing kind of the rights that special education students have, which aren't, it's called like rights without resources. But there is a legal apparatus for enforcing those, versus else there isn't the same legal framework for even making claims on those rights. At the micro level, I think we want to understand, to sit with educators and talk about this. How do you make sense of these decisions on a day-to-day basis? So many of these decisions are just very quick, minute to minute to minute. We often don't have time to really sit and make sense of them. So I think that's worth doing. I think there are different rational imperatives, and I just gave you an example of the special education versus the proficiency kind of imperatives that, there's repertoires of action that folks are using, and I think that's worth attending to. And then I think finally, kids and families have agency. They make demands, as well as, teacher is not in a bubble sealed off from the rest of the world. And so I think we also want to think about how those demands affect the way that educators distribute resources. So look forward to talking more about this, and thanks so much.
So thank you all so much for inviting me here. It's really great to, in some ways, be on this second day because you get to stand on the shoulders of giants. I hadn't turned my slides in on Monday, unfortunately, so some things that I wrote on the slides, I now feel like, I would have wanted to revise the slides to incorporate all of the great things that I've learned so far and that I look forward to learning more from you all, both in the talk and afterward. So I want to start off with, so my background is as I'm a law professor. I teach health law and bioethics at the University of Denver, and I think why I'm invited here is some work that I've done actually since the conference was postponed around allocation issues in the distribution fairly of scarce medical resources. So things like COVID-19 vaccines, critical care resources like ICU beds, other interventions like, for instance, antiviral medications. And in work, often collaboratively either with medical professionals, so clinicians, nurses, with other theorists and with social scientists, economists and sociologists. Two core goals that we've found both like sort of descriptively characterize a lot of the frameworks that have been developed by bodies like the WHO and the National Academies of the US, and also work done by theorists and also actually surveys of the public about what they think matters, are these goals that I have up here on the slide, which are first, sort of benefiting people. So in health allocation, we often put it also in terms of benefiting people and preventing harm, because in the end, an antiviral or a vaccine, the benefit it provides that protects you against the harm that you might be facing from, COVID, or in later work we looked at, the harm you might be facing from malaria, that the malaria vaccine might help to prevent. So that's one major goal. And another major goal is mitigating disadvantage, which we've sort of put in different ways, mitigating health inequity, mitigating unjust or unfair disadvantage. But the idea of this is that there's some special importance to mitigating disadvantage over and above just benefiting people, so that benefiting people or protecting them from harm when they're more disadvantaged has a kind of special importance. And theorists and many folks here that I've learned from, theorists here, disagree sometimes about the philosophical foundations of why it might be especially important to mitigate disadvantage. But I think about these two goals, there's often a degree of what, again, theorists call overlapping consensus, that even if, I was thinking about the dinner, the provocation that, should EdEthics take a political stance? Should it take a political position? I'm not sure it needs to say, why it is that we should care about these goals. But I think it's actually very hard to find folks who would say, well, we just shouldn't care at all about one of these goals or the other, or about either of them. There might be disagreement about who counts as relevantly disadvantaged. There might be disagreement about what counts as the benefits that fall properly within or without the control of the school system. But I actually think there is some consensus about, at a broad level of generality, the importance of these aims. So three things about these objectives before I go to some much more stylized slides that I think connect up with the ones that you've seen from Jen. So first is, I think these sometimes align and sometimes conflict. So sometimes they happily align. So in some work, this is by a colleague at Minnesota in sociology who I've had the pleasure of co-authoring with, but sadly for me, not on this paper, which I think is a wonderful paper. What she shows is that in distributing COVID-19 vaccines, at least in the US, it turned out that you got greater benefit per vaccine if you also considered mitigating disadvantage. So that if you prioritize people from census tracts that had a higher index of social vulnerability, or more multidimensionally disadvantaged, because those folks were exposed to greater risk of infection and greater harms if they were hospitalized because of conditions and sort of biases that are associated with being disadvantaged, biases that they face in the health system, that there were additional benefits from assisting them. There are cases where they cut against each other. So in our work on global vaccine allocations, the paper we had in Science called, it's a model for global vaccine allocation. And what turns out to be hard there is that in some cases you may have countries that really are highly disadvantaged, but also lack infrastructure to distribute vaccines, or that don't see, say, COVID-19 vaccines as one of their main things they want to invest resources in distributing, given their other challenges that they're facing. And this relates for me to what Jeff was saying about, the bubble kids, and then some kids who there may be help that they need, but the resources we have at hand to distribute may not be the ones that would actually address the problems that should have been addressed before, but that what we have to distribute through triage now, say COVID vaccines, may not actually, maybe what they need by their own lights is infrastructure or something else, some other thing that is not, I can't convert those vaccines back into, changing the harms of colonialism that may have worsened infrastructure access in those places. I think this is also true in education, I would suspect as well, and I'm interested in when you all think these will align versus diverge, some of the Q&A examples where these goals might align, examples where they might diverge. So they each have different dimensions. So you can have dimensions of benefit, of harm prevention. In health policy, we talked about preventing deaths versus years of life lost, hospitalizations. Same for disadvantage, there are different dimensions. And then to determine how to do this allocation, this triage, we need to use proxies often. So for vaccines, for instance, used proxies like census tracts I mentioned, or cutoffs based on age, which both might prevent more harm, but also exacerbate some disparities, because to live to be older is often correlated with certain forms of disadvantage. So I'm going to turn now to the sort of very stylized slides that I mentioned, which is to sort of talk about different distributions briefly and think about what we think about these trade-offs. So this is very stylized. The y-axis, what I would say, it could be anything. I have a sort of imagined top quartile, lower quartiles. You can think about this in terms of different contexts for triage and what's being triaged or allocated. So I've heard in conversations with educators, is it classroom time? Is it something like the buses that we talked about that might be sort of meso level rationing, Nima Avashi's example of the buses? Or is it the sort of macro question, talking yesterday to Jen about New Jersey school funding, at the state level, where does the state direct funding? So let's think about some changes from this sort of status quo distribution that I have up here. You can have a change where all quartiles sort of move up identically. So people benefit. You don't have special assistance, the least advantage, but they also fare better. The sort of the rising tide lifts all boats there. And I have another example where maybe higher quartiles gain much more. So there's much more overall benefit. If you imagine the buses, maybe the way you set up the buses, everybody's getting to school a lot earlier. But you have challenges in how to, whether you think some other dimension of fairness is lost. Another one where you have much more equality, the lowest quartile gains, but others drop, you have much less gain in terms of benefit. And wrapping up, I want to flip to some work I did with economists at MIT, actually in Boston College, in thinking about how to integrate these different principles. So alongside the two that I focused on, we also have other values, like for instance, backward-looking values like reciprocity in medicine. So you might say, maybe we want to recognize the contribution of physicians. So what I have up here is a slide where little figures in red that have the stethoscope and the little badge. Those are the essential personnel who are candidates for a scarce antiviral at the time, remdesivir. And there are different ways you might try to operationalize a priority for this value. And working with Parag Pathak and these colleagues, we developed was what we called a categorized priority system, where the folks coming from the essential personnel group would receive priority not for all the resources. They wouldn't get sort of an extra point for every remdesivir dose that was up for allocation. But there would be some category of remdesivir, maybe 20% of doses, that was prioritized for them, and then allocated to that group preferentially on the familiar grounds of how much medically they could gain from the intervention. So thinking about methodologies for integrating multiple values in allocation, I think, is an important thing that I found valuable in bioethics and also interested to think about in educational ethics. So thank you.
It's on. Yeah. Good morning, fam. How you doing?
Good.
So I don't have slides, right? So we're not going to do that. We're just going to talk. So first, I want to say thank you to Mira for allowing me to come and present and asking me to do this, even though I'm very, very nervous. But also, I want to thank the educators up front who continue to do this work despite a lot of the issues that we're naming today, that we're going to continue to name. But also, not despite these issues, but also because of them, that they choose to stay in here and try to become more part of that solution. So I want to talk a little bit about what my work looks like on a day-to-day basis in the field of special education, but also as a leadership coach. And so those two things kind of lend itself to a lot of ethical issues. So I'm going to name about 3 things, and this is very practical, like kind of on the ground, what happens in schools on a day-to-day basis. Number 1, thinking about what we promise students with disabilities and their families versus what we can deliver. So during COVID, there was remote learning, everything shut down, students were not being serviced appropriately. We knew that, right? So the solution to that, from a mandate from the city, was to then give them quote-unquote recovery services, right? And so you go in, you look at how they progressed or didn't progress, and then you offer them a set amount of hours to sort of recover their learning. Theoretically, I guess that sounds cute, but in reality, it's not. It is not, right? Because in general, what ended up happening is we were extremely short-staffed across the city, across the country, but specifically in my context, across the city. So when we make these offerings, teachers got very pissed, rightfully so, that they were saying, Talia, I do not want to lie to my families. Right? That is a real thing. I do not want to lie to my families. I know for a fact there's no one here who's going to provide a service for this student. And so that became an immediate issue, right? And so I'm not going to tell people to lie. I can only tell you what the mandate is. But I'm not going to coerce or tell anyone, yes, you must write that down and sign your name on it because now you are liable. And I understand that. So one of the issues that came up around that is not only just the quantity of hours that had to be allocated, but also the quality of the instruction. So let me go back. For example, Ms. Jackson is a developing teacher. She hasn't done very well on her evaluations. Her students are not moving, but Ms. Jackson has a special education certification, and she is able to provide the services, and she volunteers to do so. I did not do well in Ms. Jackson's class, but that's the only person who's available now to give me my recovery services. What is the ethical thing to do in that situation? You only have who you have. So that's a conversation that is coming up constantly in classrooms, and they are very upset about the fact that this is the options that they've been given. Right? So that's one part. The other part is when we think about the quality and the quantity of the services that we're giving, we're also thinking about biases and how that affects kids geographically. So I work in East Harlem. That is not the most easiest place to staff. People do not want to go to Harlem. People do not want to go to the South Bronx, right? So when kids need speech services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, the providers do not want to go there. They're telling us blatantly, I will not travel above the Upper West Side. I will not travel here, right? So automatically, the most vulnerable students are already put in a position where they will not get not only their base services, but any quote-unquote recovery services. My second point is around the point that Jen highlighted in the beginning, which was around this notion of all students can learn, but the whole question that I'm asking is, can all students be proficient? And I don't think that is how we approach this conversation. And we do so with thinking exactly as Jen mentioned. I sit in rooms all the time with principals, teacher teams, teachers, and the first thing they do is they take the item skills analysis, they look at the students, and they start to figure out who is salvageable. Who can I save here? If you're not salvageable, then you're gonna go over here. Interesting thing about that is it works both ways, right? So you have your proficient students, which in New York State, that's levels 3s and level 4s. The level 4s get ignored. Thank you for your service, thank you for contributing to our data, but we will not contribute to you, right? And making you any more smart or giving you any more additional push, right? And then for the level 3s, it's like, thank you again for your service, just do not lapse, right? We just want you to stay steady. The 2.8s, the 2.7s, those are the ones who get majority of the attention. And we know that, right? So the level 1s forget about it. And
again, the level ones are the ones that I'm usually responsible for because those are largely the students with disabilities. So you can only imagine what that conversation is looking like when I'm in rooms and I'm just like, yes, we are talking about testing, but that is not the sum of everything. But it kind of is, right? So that's the unfortunate part. Moving on to the last point, let me know if I'm talking too long. The idea of being certified versus being qualified. And I think those two things are used interchangeably, and that is not true. So, for example, I'm certified in special education. There are 13 different classifications within IDEA. I am not an expert on all 13 classifications. So what we're seeing now, about 2 weeks ago, I was at a principal's meeting and I presented on some program recommendation services and how they were misaligned and students were not receiving their services appropriately. One principal said, rightfully so, I have my teachers in there, my mandates are met, but my teacher is not equipped to handle all of the influx of students we have coming in on the autism spectrum disorder, right, classification. We do not have the training in that. That is absolutely correct. And so I think in terms of looking at the medical field, right, one of the things we can copy is this idea that there's specialties. I don't go to the doctor. I go to the cardiologist when my heart is in, problem. I go to the neurologist. I need to know that if I'm going to have a special educator in my classroom, is it for the, does it align to the needs that are in the room? So if I have a student or several students who have, are classified as having autism spectrum disorder, who is actually trained to do ABA, to do applied behavioral analysis, who's actually, engaged in doing these behavioral issues, because that's highly what the issue is. So some people are like, I know how to triage, if you will, the academic spaces, but the behaviors are like something that most people are not equipped to deal with. So I think, and that's most of even when I teach teaching exceptional learners here for J-term, that is one of the main things that comes up is that we don't have the practical on the ground, what do I do tomorrow situation. And so that's kind of the conversations that we're having. Finally, I'll just say this because it's been said throughout the conference, is around this idea of our integrity, right, is always at stake as educators, especially as special educators, right? And I asked my group of special educators that I meet with every other month, just to kind of think about just to reflect on how are you constantly either negotiating, affirming, negating, compromising your values on a regular basis, on a daily basis that is happening. And so to what extent are you okay with that, right? What can you live with? What can you not live with? I think that's a conversation that I'm constantly having with them because it is important for them to know where they stand in relation to what is happening and what they're going to not do. Some of my teachers are very clear on the line they will not cross. One being that I'm not going to sign documents that is lying to families. That is the upstanding thing to do regardless of what policy says. So with that being said, I put that same question back out to the audience, is that how are you negotiating, how are you affirming or negating your own values in this work, and what is the next step? Thank you.
Thank you all for these wonderful presentations that I think speak to some of these very pressing matters. Maybe we'll start off the way most people have in the previous panels, but really with Kalya's final question, sort of thrown back to you, and if you want to take 2 minutes to either think about it or chat about it, how are your own perceptions or values implicated in the effort to think about or implement the effort to allocate resources to your students in the college classroom or in a K-12 classroom. Some of the pressures that Kalya was describing probably is less typical of a college classroom where we see fewer particularly high need special education students, but I think all of us are experiencing a much higher need environment in our classrooms ever since COVID. And we do see a lot of pressure to address what might be called more colloquially as special needs of our students, particularly around mental health and similar pressures. And so how are you thinking about the allocation of your own resources or some of these questions that were raised within your own practice or research? So let's take 2 minutes to just think or converse on that, and then we'll turn back to the panel.
Are you talking?
Oh my god. I'm not teaching right now, but I am parenting and I think about my values every day.
And what do you prioritize? What do you hold the resources for?
From yesterday. I read No, it's more complicated. Some matrix thing. You know how
I realized I think it's like, is she safe? Does she feel loved? Does she have like the space and tools to regulate? And like a sub question of that is like, am I regulated?
It doesn't surprise me that you remembered your daughter.
Am I like citing values in my rationale for things like explicitly? And is she thriving, like academically, socially, all of it?
To reality. I guess
But I think like in the moment, like the question more than anything is something closer to like, am I actively doing harm? Like, you know, so it's like she's got the plate of food and she's not eating her vegetables, and it's like, am I actively?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm like, do I make her eat her vegetables?
Yeah.
What am I teaching her? Like, what am I teaching her about?
I'm guessing
You know?
she's very young.
She's 3. Yeah.
She's 3.
Yeah.
I mean, if you imagine like when she enters school,
Yeah.
those are not going to change.
No, and well, she's already in
Is she
school, and we're
loved?
constantly.
Is she safe?
Yeah.
Right?
Same
That's
stuff.
like absolutely the top priority.
Yeah.
I feel like implicit in what you're saying is like, what is the quality of relating
Yeah.
in
Yes.
the environment? Right?
And that's how I changed as a teacher from like year 1 to year 7 was
Right.
like the top priority every day was the relationship.
I
And so we
agree,
would
100%.
stop like, there would be classes where it would be like, we'd be 30 minutes in and we hadn't started the
Yeah.
lesson yet because there's something in the room
Yes.
that needed space that needed to be
Yeah.
addressed.
Yeah.
But like, you know, to Jennifer's point at the very, very beginning, like that feeling of like you can always be doing more. It's never enough. Like that is an
Yeah,
exhausting feeling.
But I do feel like when your priority is in a relationship, over and above your performance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If your set of priorities is like, as a teacher, let's say, or as a principal,
Yeah.
are the students feeling safe and affirmed and safe
Yeah.
and loved in this
Yeah.
place? That's relationship.
Right.
Nothing can happen without that, right? That's the foundation.
I tried to make stuff happen without that. It didn't work.
But it's really, no, it's
Yeah,
like, you
yeah.
know, that's how we learn.
Right.
Right? That's how you figure out as a teacher, and I 100% resonate with
Yeah.
your description. I feel like the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was the learning.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like it's the priorities on the relationship and the environment. The performance becomes secondary.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are we putting into that space? What are the foundational conditions in that space that is
try to
the school?
structure it to have incentives.
I think that's where my values too lie. Like we have to make sure
This was
that
sort of began with some
we're
graphic evidence.
putting our resources into creating a space that's
His great
conducive to
success was
positive relationships
to vast
and then to deep learning. Right?
Yeah. That's right.
So actually, I want to start us off with a couple of sort of like general questions, but we'll move fairly quickly into questions from you all to make up for my negligence. And so maybe we can start off by just trying to think together about the context in which the decisions about triage and rationing is being made. Govin gave us the healthcare context and metaphor, talking about bedside rationing, right? So basically decisions that are being made by a doctor at the immediate context of a patient. And of course, from what we heard, there are these decisions that are being made with the huge spreadsheets in Texas or in other contexts, right? So a lot of the decisions are being made at the classroom or grade level. Where should decisions about triage and rationing be made? Are they most appropriate in the most immediate context of the person, like the teacher familiar with the students, or should they be made more higher up? Are they informed by different principles if they are made at different levels? So would any of you want to think with us about that? Jen, do you want to say?
Yeah, okay. So I would say that at present, these decisions, because of the centrality of proficiency and accountability systems, are being made at the level of the testing contractor and the technical advisory group in terms of where we set these cut points. So it's interesting because it's not an elected group of folks. Ultimately, it's an appointed group of folks, and it's not thought through as that kind of decision. Like, there is a technical process that guides test construction and scaling, and setting proficiency and cut scores. So, I mean, I think to the extent we can make these more transparent and public, that is what we're doing when we're setting these cut scores. I like the conversation coming above the level of any individual school or district. But I think in education, given that we have 15,000 districts, gazillions of schools, etc., we have discretion has to be part of the story as well. I think right now we're just not acknowledging at what level we're doing that.
Right. Yeah, so I think we're always it's going to be inescapable to be dealing with triage at multiple policy levels. So I don't think we're going to get away from dealing with it in the classroom at the level of, districts and, who gets the best start time for class, which grade, or the level of the state. For me, I think, rather than so much the where, it's the sort of who gets involved in being able to set the ethical frameworks for how those decisions are made, and whether those decisions are made using a ethical framework that, for instance, might be informed by the judgments of educators at the classroom level, versus sort of discretion being exercised maybe without so much guidance by that educator. And I think there is a real trade-off here, and my disposition is maybe not surprising as somebody who designs ethical frameworks, is to think it would be better to have frameworks for each of these levels that is informed by educators, students, and others, but not to have so much unguided discretion. But a concern you could have from somebody, and again, I'm not someone who's been in the K-12 classroom setting as a teacher, is that my suggestion of having frameworks to try to improve fairness and avoid certain kinds of biases in the moment might leave less room for kind of the phronesis of the virtuous educator within the classroom to exercise their discretion to sort of achieve optimal triage.
All right, so my response is, I like to focus on my locus of control, right? And so I'm always thinking about what's happening at the school level, because I support schools, and schools are their own little microcosms of what's going on. And so one of the things that I do think we do have ethical frameworks within our schools. They're called our mission statements. And so when you have a mission statement, I'm very interested in how does that live in the school, right? We always write these really funny, really pretty things, right? All students can learn, and justice and community and equity, and throw every word you can find in the dictionary and put it in there. That gives people all the feels. But in reality, kids are miserable. Kids are miserable. I've been in a lot of classrooms where they're saying we prioritize joy. And there's not much joy happening in both of these places. The adults are miserable, the kids are mad, like people are calling out left and right. We have a really like huge chronic absenteeism rate right now. This is across the country, this is also across in our classrooms, right? I mean, like in the city. And I'm like, you're focusing on the student attendance, which is interesting, fine. But then what happens at the teacher level? Teachers are falling out too, right? So you're like, the students are out. Obviously something's not happening in the school that they feel like they should go there instead of staying home, as I say, and watch Coco Melon, right? There's a reason why the kids are not staying in the classrooms. They're feeling more, I mean, what am I getting if I'm gonna come to school anyway and score at a level 1 and you're gonna tell me I'm a level 1, you know, all of that. I just don't see, I do think we have our ethical frameworks. I don't know if we embody them yet. I just think we're at a place where we write really nice things so that when you come in and we get like the state comes in or the superintendent comes in, right? You need to show that you have internalized language, but not that you've internalized how to be with children. And so that's kind of how I'm seeing it. I'm not sure who should be making, I think we're already making those decisions. So it's hard for me to say like who should be making them, they're being made. So it's just a matter of, are you living up to the ethical standards that you've presented? So I don't know if I can answer the question.
No, I really think you have, and to some extent, I think what it exemplifies, your words just now, Kalia, but all three of you, is that there is a level of professional autonomy, probably, that comes into the question of how we can serve everyone. Right, so level of discretion or phronesis or right decision making at the professional level closer to the children that actually might allow us to make decisions that would be more beneficial, right, rather than having to live by the mandates of the cutoffs that are made outside of our control. And so I'm wondering, okay, so I'll ask a quick, like a general question, but I'm going to invite people to start lining up because I really want to hear questions from the audience. And we already have volunteers, so maybe I'll speak mine. I just say, like, I think really what is probably reflected here is the pushback against the notion that we have to sacrifice learning for all for the sake of proficiency for some, right? That maybe there are ways to organize our practice that do not necessitate this. But seeing how many questions are lining up, I'm going to take away the microphone from myself and give it to Daniela over here.
Thank you. I'm Daniela, and I'm a bit shorter than this microphone. This is a fantastic discussion and has really prompted some thinking as an Australian in a completely different context with policies. So I just want to ask if you guys can clarify for me something. What is at stake behind some of these decisions? So I really like the idea of supportive frameworks and the decisions that have already been made and the use of mission statements in schools to help support teacher discretion. But what is at stake if test scores fall below proficiency? So what are schools actually afraid of? What are the consequences? And how can these consequences for schools be perhaps reframed? Like in bioethics, for example, the concern might be both the likelihood of the quality of life, for the redistributed resource, but also I imagine the hospital will be concerned about their institutional reputation. And so for schools, the accountability to test scores, what's at stake for the school and for its teachers themselves if they take these discretionary choices to focus on the bubble kids and not the parts of the classroom, and seeking that, the kind of resources that would actually support Bart's particular needs. So I guess there's this unacknowledged layer of consequences that as an Australian we don't have those policies. I want you to that.
So, great question. So, at this particular moment, during the No Child Left Behind era, there was a kind of progressive series of sanctions that after 5 years could lead to your school being closed. That's now been walked back. so that states are being asked to focus on the bottom 5% or so of schools, but at the level of teachers, most states during the 2009 forward period, Greece to the top part of our policy history, implemented teacher evaluation systems where teachers are getting rated on value added plus other observational measures. And so I guess in terms of what's at stake, there's certainly empirical evidence that your test scores matter, right? Proficiency does not. Is an imaginary threshold. It's not like life or death, like the one true outcome perhaps you have in social science and natural science. Do I want to say anything else there? I'm going to turn over the mic and then move back around.
So I really liked what Jen was just saying about in math. I had written down artificial and real, and I think it's really useful. So thinking it from a theoretical perspective about ideas of, I gave you in the slides what people in philosophy would call a sort of prioritarian approach, where you give some priority to meeting the needs of folks who are more disadvantaged. So I didn't say how much. And one question in the theoretical debate that has practical implications we're talking about here is, are there discrete sort of thresholds of sufficiency within that broad priority? And which of those are sort of real? Like real places where jumping over the threshold makes a difference to how your life goes, and which are imaginary or artificial. So in health policy, I was thinking about, with the COVID vaccine, it's a spectrum, it's a continuum of how much harm will prevent. But if we can keep somebody out of the hospital, prevent a hospitalization, that was a big, I think, sort of real threshold that mattered. In contrast, in health policy, if it's something like, it'll make you score better in arbitrary algorithms threshold, then it's not clear that sort of matters in itself. You might say this arbitrary threshold isn't actually tracking or measuring what we care about how people's lives go. So I'm curious, for Colleen and Jen and all of you, I was thinking, where is it for me, not as an educational ethicist yet, I guess, I would say, the real threshold, the ones that seem like costly, is getting somebody, for instance, to high school graduation, like keeping somebody out of the hospital by giving them COVID vaccine.
Yeah. Right, which could be a real sort of like cutoff that's meaningful, but I really keep thinking about the 18 to 40 jump, right, which is an amazing jump if you think about, right, it's an amazing improvement of a person's actual capacities, but it doesn't count at all, right? Okay, so we should take another.
Can I just
Okay.
So I think also there's a conversation that something that's not coming up is like not only what's at stake, but who's at stake. And I think that when you talk about the opt-out movement and people who don't have to test, those are places that are highly privileged that typically don't test, or whereas the ones who are most vulnerable, they do test, and they test and not as well. And then what does that mean for their enrollment? Because nobody wants to send their child to a failing school. So I think like there's this role, you know what I mean? There's this cyclical effect where some people don't even have to sit because of anxiety or whatever they experience. Like my kid can't do this test. So you know what I mean? You can do that too in certain districts, and in other districts you cannot do that. You can't say, because like now you're talking about attendance, you're talking about funding, you're talking about a whole bunch of other things now that are connected, that like some of our most vulnerable kids do not even have the option really to opt out. Like they can, but they really can't. So I think that's also like a who's at stake, just as much as the what. Great.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm a first-year doctoral student at the Ed School here. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. Before coming to the Ed School, I spent most of the last decade teaching middle school and high school history. And so what that means is over the last year, they've really been trying to socialize me into what it means to do research. And I've really been kind of figuring out, resisting and chafing against how I see academia conceptualizing both research and the K through 12 educational sphere. And so I think how that came up for me in this panel was we kind of spoke about teachers in as if we weren't a part of that educational space. And for example, in that last question, it was thrown back to us to all imagine like how, moral injury or how we navigate the moral complexities of being a teacher. But I'm wondering, I see it coming up in the way that we do research to people or about people and not with people. And so I want to ask the panel how, if you consider yourself more in the researcher realm, like how you as a researcher navigate moral injury. And if you consider yourself more in the practitioner realm, what you would like to see from university-based researchers in collaboration with you to help you navigate the moral injuries of your own realm.
Ooh, good question.
Do you want to start?
Oh, you just took that man? Okay. I just said good question. I ain't bothered. So I'll say this much. I think when it comes down to like I just finished my doctorate in ed back in December. But that's not like the way that I approach it. Thank you so much. That's not the way that I approach the work. I'm like very much like on the ground, and one of the things that came up for me recently that I loved, and like maybe this is coming up, I think Jen, you kind of alluded to it. Dr. Ruha Benjamin talks about this idea of datafication of injustice, which basically means like we study a problem so much, but we already know the problem exists. So how much data do you need to support what we already know to be true? So there's a lot of times where like I'm sitting in meetings and then I get like another set of data charts that told me about what I already knew, Black and brown children are failing. Thank you, I know that. Right, so I don't know how many different studies we need to do on that, and I think that's where like research kind of throws me off after a certain point, because I'm just like, I heard this 12 different ways. How many times do you want me to say that these same kids are failing? I don't know if that is where I want my time spent. I am more interested in collaborating with the community in terms of understanding like parents and like how they are looking at what they want for their children. Not having someone come and like do a study on children and have this like distance from them to where they can, I just, that feels really icky for me. So again, I think that, it's never to say like, oh, we don't need researchers, we do. But I think like, how many different ways can you say that, the sun is hot, it's like water's wet, we get it, so.
So I very much, that was fantastic. I very much remember the struggle. At the beginning of graduate school, I'm just feeling this massive disjuncture between what mattered in schools and what the conversations were. So I think that I'm glad that you're having that struggle, and I hope you don't lose that struggle. I think it's very easy over time the further away you get from schools, the less you feel that pull. And so I think in my own work, I would both argue for the importance of there being researchers that are coming in respectful partnership in terms of what's being studied, and in terms of just the kind of giving people dignity and a sense of full personhood. At the same time, it's not at the same time, it's that some of the findings that I reported to you here, I can tell you that the school is not thrilled. And I think that part of what I hope that I accomplished in terms of, writing these papers was to create an environment where these teachers were less likely to keep having to make those choices, but you're not on average going to get a thank you note for, kind of revealing things that don't look good in the light of day, but are happening, and certainly the high school I taught at did the same thing as well. And so I think that there is an argument for separation, but I also think you can do that in respect. You can still give participants dignity and respect. And I think that a lot of the ways we talk in education policy, especially in the quantitative space, are it's kind of just maddening, honestly. Like there's some conferences I don't go to anymore because I just like my ears, are on fire. I don't know if that helps, but it's a struggle.
Just a little quick. So the talk at the end of yesterday, my colleague from the bioethicist, Dr. Peeler, made a point about some structures of reward for different types of research that I think is really interesting to think about in the context of your question, which is what types of research are like funded and rewarded and valued, and if it's the type that Jen was talking about as maybe being the maddening kind, that is how grant money and rewards and other things flow to people. I think that's something to think about in sort of constructing a field of educational ethics is, what kind of work is going to be rewarded and funded and supported. The other thing I would say, which I think is in some ways inspired by the last panel when I want to complicate this idea of dignity, which I would like to afford to everyone. But when people do sort of community-based research, the fact that communities are not monolithic is going to often mean that there are people who are both going to feel like their dignity is upheld in advance, and that it's not by the very same sort of project or question that we would ask. And sometimes it almost seems like a triage problem to me that I'm not sure we can get around the fact that in the last panel I think folks were saying, look, for instance, if you're designing an ethical framework and you want to say that you're hearing the community's voices, there's not one voice of the community, there are many voices, and maybe this is too skeptical. There seem to be unavoidable trade-offs in doing that, in which voices we lift up. And I have a colleague who works on informal representation, which informal representatives we pick to speak on behalf of people. And I think they're real, and I think at least it seems to me right now, really challenging trade-offs.
Great.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Duran. I'm graduating from the PhD program here at Justin. I was also a middle school teacher. I'm really, really grateful to this panel. I've been struck by how in a lot of education research and policy and philosophy of education, there's this assumption that resource allocation is between an adult or a small group of adults who are in charge of distributing scarce resources to an individual student or a group of individual students. So the classroom level, a teacher who is distributing their attention to student A, student B, or student C, or in funding a group of adults who make a decision about school A, school B, school C. But we know that this is not how classrooms and schools operate. So in a classroom, you've got a teacher in charge of 20-odd students who are themselves interacting. At a school level, you have multiple adults who are moving between multiple classrooms, and all of these relationships and communities create their own opportunities for resource allocation. And we can also think about students as being able to be resources for each other within this model of triage. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that peers, that student interaction, adult interaction, and these group dynamics might play in creating a really realistic model of triage for the education world.
So I think the initial thought was inspired by the vaccine thing. It was maybe a little bit half-baked. But I think this is great and complicates this, but also creates sort of tough trade-offs for me that I would love to be helped by you all in thinking about this, which is that your example about peers I really like, but it's sort of, in some cases, someone's receipt of a resource will have beneficial effects for others, as we saw for vaccines, and that someone who is sort of at the center of a community network, their receiving a vaccine had beneficial consequences for people in their social network. Here's the hard trade-off puzzle for me. What if there are some folks who could individually benefit a lot, but they're not well-positioned, maybe for reasons of injustice, maybe not, to sort of have a multiplier effect within the classroom? Is it fair to them to, consider that factor when, and again, my guess is that probably in informal rationing, folks think about that a lot. But, how comfortable, or setting aside comfortable and uncomfortable, what should we make of that if we're trying to quantify? I really like the idea of not just treating it as a static, fixed pot of resources, but that how you allocate can have dynamic effects, can shift this amount of attention or help or care that we can give, but how to think about the sort of scenario that I identified.
I'll add to that. I really like that question a lot. Certainly, I think comes up a lot when we read Sandy Jenks, what must be equal for opportunity to be equal, right? It's always kind of well, where are the peers in this? So I think peers are absolutely a resource that can help in the right kind of combinations to produce more resources, right, from each other. I also am thinking about the question of how to operationalize your point about agency. I think I like the way that you put that, because it's not like you can sit back in a dark room and do the trolley problem. You're constantly, even if you're trying to do an action, there are other people who are interfering with or pushing along in your direction in that action. So I think that's the interesting space of giving people more tools to think about these things, because so much of classroom, at least in my own experience, of classroom practice is like just responding to stimuli on a constant basis without a framework. But certainly, I think any kind of mode of educational ethics needs to take into account the limited total control of the educators.
So the only one thing that's coming up for me, and I don't know if this is going to completely answer the question, but I am thinking about, when you talked about the relationship, I'm thinking about the relationship between what we call the instructional core, which is the teacher, the content, and the student, right? That triangle, and once that triangle is in balance, what happens to the whole structure, right? So, for example, like if the teacher doesn't have a good grasp on their curriculum, that's automatically going to have an impact on how they relate to students. To even know whether and when to use student-to-student interaction, right? You don't even know how to do that. You don't even know how to teach what you've come to teach. I think that also your relationship to your students is extremely important, where you can have these great relationships and don't know pedagogy, right? Or you don't know your curriculum, right? So then you have this, like, again, the line goes in this very weird direction where everything is interdependent. You can't be really great with your curriculum and have no type of connection with your students, because now all this knowledge lives with you and it doesn't kind of pass on to anyone else. So I think what I'm hearing from your question is really just that triangle for me is really grounding in some ways, in terms of just if you know what you're teaching and you know who you're teaching really well, those things usually do come together. That does minimize the amount of issues you have in classrooms, right? The way that you even approach the content in a way that makes it relevant to students, that they feel that they have actionable things that they can do with the curriculum, all of that matters. So I'm looking at it from kind of that way. I don't know if it's
Right, so I want to suggest that we take the two remaining questions together, because we want to make sure everyone gets lunch as well.
Yes.
So we take the two remaining questions together and then concluding comments.
All right, thanks all for this great panel. Terry Wilson, University of Colorado Boulder. And I think my question builds on Daniela's. I just was really struck in listening to all three panels, particularly Jen and then you, about the power and durability of proficiency as an idea, but also these frameworks, right? Because I think there's been this huge body of research that has documented both the moral and material harms, including your article 20 years ago. But yet they, or something like that. Yeah, I think it was great. It was great 20 years ago. It's still great. I'm still teaching it. But I think there's this way in which, we've documented these harms, but I was really struck by how they're still being used in the context of New York City and these decision making. And I just wondered about, how do we think about the value of proficiency as an ideal in helping us think about questions of, achievement, equity, justice, and then how might we think about maybe connecting it to the previous panel on data? Are there different ways to think about the creation of evidence and data that we're using to measure this, and to think about both the control of that data and resistance to that data, or thinking about alternate measures of making sure that data is locally controlled, source, controlled, or maybe moving to things like sampling, where we don't test every kid in every grade every year ad nauseum.
Hi, my name is Babatunde Alfred. I'm a PhD student at Boston College in the education school. I've been recently interviewing some teachers on teacher time and the ways in which they feel constrained by the amount of time they have to do what they need to do. And one of the teachers I just interviewed was talking about sort of triaging different problems that come up within the school throughout the school day, different emergencies, different types of students and their needs. And she brought up the fact that students are dealing with their own sort of neuroatypicalities all the time, but so are teachers. And there are a lot of expectations that are put on teachers to respond to triaging in a certain sort of way that is incongruous with their own neuroatypicality. So I'm curious how you all might think about triage and how we deal with triage in schools when problems arise, and the ways in which administrative procedures disregard or don't make space for teachers' own difficulties in dealing with particular constraints with time and just how they're trying to help their students.
So obviously we can't all address all of these, but if you want to pick some thread from these questions.
Have me at cue. Oh, you see?
Oh,
Looking at me?
you-
No, it's fine. No, I'm taking a cue. I'm taking a cue. So I'm thinking about the first question in terms of testing. I always tell people, like, I'm not a big fan of testing, but I'm a really big fan of assessment. So I want that to be like distinguished in advance, right? That you should always be assessing your children. I think as a special educator, the thing that really puts special educators in a really bad position is that they're like, you're constantly telling me to differentiate content, process, product, all of these things, and then the test looks uniform, right? And so that's really unfair to keep telling people, go these different rounds, and you can do a rap, and you can do a song, and you can do a dance, and you can do all this stuff. And that's not real. You're getting a piece of paper, a pencil, and a Scantron, and you will be bubbling in responses. Like, that is how we're going to measure what you've known, even though you did this wonderful rap on DNA and all kinds of other stuff, right? So I think that's like one of the other, one of the major issues I have with like how testing is even kind of played around with. The other thing around the time, though, talking to principals often, the first thing they'll tell you is they have the time. That's the first thing they'll say. I've scheduled their time. They have preps. They have planning time. They have this. 'Cause I work predominantly with integrated co-teachers. So they're, gen ed, special ed teacher in a classroom. That is chaos most of the time because people do not know how to work together. It's very Ike and Tina under normal circumstances. But I think that people assume that because I gave you time, that now you know what to do with it, right? And I think that there is not enough guidance on like what is that. Like, I come in and I actually give them tools to say, like, here's how you make agreements with your other co-teacher. Here's where you discuss your strengths and your areas of growth. Here's where you are telling them, I'm good with the technology, I'll take this, you do this. But that conversation is not innate. People don't just normally say, hey, what are you good at? What am I good at? The first thing they're thinking is, why are you here? I don't want to work with you, right? Like, so I think that is that's a normal way of approaching it. So I think, like, again, the issue with time is it's cool to get it, but it's useless if you really do not know how to utilize your time, So that's as much I can say about that. I'm taking up too much time.
I'll respond to the first and the second. I'm coming back to this idea of sort of imaginary and real thresholds, and I think about something Harry Brickhouse said about flourishing yesterday. And to me, I think flourishing is the sort of thing we care about in the end, and it's sort of funny to think, unlike flourishing, which seems really important, that sort of proficiency as such abstract thing would be sort of important as opposed to imaginary. But at the same time, I think about being divergent about this. I think that there is a real value to trying to do some quantification to get at which things we do serve flourishing versus not, because if we don't quantify, I worry that then we aren't able to get the value of the sort of research that folks like Jen do. And so for me, what I'm sort of wrestling with and thinking about the first question is, how can we, so I guess that I don't go down the sort of Foucauldian path of saying, no, if we try to quantify it, it's bad. But how do we pick the quantitative metrics that get at the right thing? At least I tend to think like flourishing is something that is the right thing and matters. How can we identify measures or ways of doing research that get at that, as opposed to trapping us to the level of the imaginary things? For the second, I really like the second question about the teachers. What I want to know, and actually want to know from research, is like, where do we get to the sweet spot between giving teachers discretion in ways that actually makes things go badly for them, for their flourishing, because of the point that you, Babatunde, nicely raised, versus taking away too much discretion from them via the sort of frameworks that folks like me up here are into. That teachers might say, no, these aren't realistic. They're coming down from on high. They're not attentive toward it. So how do we strike that sweet spot between discretion and frameworks that I think can be responsive to a broader set of voices?
Should I do quick? Okay. So I'll go on Terry's question. So I think that the problem is fundamentally a problem of goal conflicts that we're trying to resolve through technical systems. If we just took this as a technical problem, we could get a bunch of us together, we could build the Ferrari of better ways to manage this. You could not test everyone every year. You could, instead of kind of creating this false, small comparison differences between schools, you could say, so cardiac surgery, what they do for risk-adjusted mortality for CABG and PCI, so angioplasty is to say, are you like statistically much better than you would have been expected to be, much worse, or just in the same range? And if we use that framework, I think that most schools are basically in range. And I think that would take some of this pressure off. But I think the reason we don't do it is because of that broader values and kind of unwillingness to acknowledge the value conflict that we have.
Well, thank you so much for a really wonderfully rich panel. I appreciate your thoughts and your time and everyone's attention. And please join me in thanking our